Hi, everyone. Good morning and welcome to this talk. Thanks for taking the time to be present here. I'm just going to share my screen very quickly. Here we go. So today's talk is going to be focused on the energy transition. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact that IoT and digital transformation is having on this industry. And then I was going to go into a little bit around personal brand and some of the trends I'm seeing and career paths and maybe some advice, and take your questions on any thoughts you have or concerns you have about your next career move. Okay. The objective today is to provide an overview of the industry. There is a lot to take in around the energy transition. It's a really vast industry with a range of different contributors, suppliers, technology providers, and it encompasses a lot. Today is more about providing you with an overview on the industry and some of the work that my company is doing in the space. And then discussing some of the trends that we're seeing in the world of investment and kind of what I'm hearing from some venture capitalist firms and investment houses in terms of what they're looking at putting their money behind. And then, as I said, the final point is talk a little bit about your future and employment. And given COVID, try and look at it from more about a current economic climate and see kind of where we're going to move, go moving forward. So these are the three key areas. And I thought I would start off by talking about my background, just so you have some context about who I am and where I come from and what I do. And so I presume if there are any questions that you wanted to ask, then this may make it a little bit more helpful as well. So I started my career in Google. I've given short descriptions. I'm sure everybody knows who Google is. I then worked at Facebook, and both of those roles involved business development. And soon after that, in 2012, co-founded a company with a couple of colleagues and partners, specifically around nanotechnology. So Crystallusion was our first business, and then we evolved into this company called Global Nano Network, which we started up only 2 years ago. And this is a company that's focused on the energy industry. We're developing a battery, and our objective is to try and develop a battery that is 100% recyclable and is non-dependent on lithium and lithium polymers. Okay. And so I have a little bit of experience in this field, and we also do a lot of work in rural parts of India. So I'm just sharing this with you so you have a feel for who I am and what my background is. So the reason I'm excited to talk about this topic, the energy transition, is because energy literally covers every aspect of our lives. If we think about it, everything from light bulbs to your cars, to your houses, to mobile phones, laptops, you name it. Literally, we are surrounded by the demand we have as a nation, as human beings for energy. And so what we're starting to see is this radical shift in what is called the energy transition towards more sustainable sources of energy. And that's effectively, in a nutshell, what this is. Now, I've pulled up this article just because, I think it highlights very quickly what we're trying to address with this energy transition, which is we are very heavily dependent on fossil fuels, as we know. We're constantly, whether it's cars, planes, trains, etc., buses. And what seems to be happening now in this trend is that we're going to be shifting away from fossil fuels into more sustainable sources. And the impact this is going to have on global economies, on businesses, on suppliers, on every part of the ecosystem is going to be really incredible. And so if we look at the profound ramifications this can have on the financial markets, even simply from thinking about it from a COVID perspective of what we've seen over the last few months, we get a glimpse into how big an effect this can really have. For those of you that do look at the global markets and follow trading, it was since a very, very long time that oil prices actually went into negative territory. Now, for oil prices to go into negative territory is a really, really big deal. And it was so bad that at one point they were looking at how do we just simply store this? Where do we store the excess supply that there is of oil? And so the only companies that were trading that were actually making any money were the ones that are able to store it, right? So think of how much you pay per liter for petrol to fill your car, and how much of an effect that is having on the industry, that all of a sudden, instead of having an excess of supply and requiring more and more, what we're seeing is that all of that excess that is existing has to be stored because no one's using their cars anymore. Because all of a sudden the aviation industry has gone into lockdown and there are less flights, and 75% of the fleets of airlines are now on standby and parked away. And so this was a really, really interesting glimpse into what could happen when this industry is so dependent on fossil fuels, and when this energy transition occurs, what is the next step and what's going to occur from there. Just give me 1 second. I'm just gonna. So as I mentioned, the reason this is an extremely interesting topic is because it spans across everything we do, right? So, now we're shifting towards this world where IoT and digital transformation is becoming even greater. If you think about the number of people that are now working from home, a lot of tech companies have said this is the new norm. This is what they want to encourage their employees to do. So they're all going to be starting to work from home more and more. Again, the use of energy doesn't change between what they're doing in the office to their houses, but the way the energy is distributed does. And we're thinking about things like connected fridges. So not only are fridges now plugged into the grid, but they're now providing you with additional technology or utility, right? By being connected to the cloud and being able to do some really sophisticated things. The demand for this is only going to increase as we progress. And some of you potentially maybe already are thinking about or will eventually be building new technologies that are all going to be pulling off of what is known as the national grid and how we access that. And so it's interesting for you to think a little bit about what is the mix and how do we actually obtain all of this information, all of this energy, and where is it coming from? So this is just a small glimpse, and I don't have too many slides, I should say. I've just got a few, and was hoping to start a discussion and answer any questions that you may have, or even take comments from yourselves. But this was just a glimpse to show you what is meant by the energy mix and what is meant by this energy transition. As you can see, a big part of it is dependent on fossil fuels. And what we're looking at is how do we reach more sustainable development or sustainable goals, moving forwards 10, 20, 30, 40 years from today. And obviously the key thing to take away from this is when you're looking at the colors, if you like, right? Green tends to be affiliated or associated with renewable energy. As you can see, by 2040, the goals are to really push that. Now, what's really important to also understand from here is this is not only being driven by the fact that we have challenges with climate change. We're seeing these become more and more apparent, and scientists are proving to us this is something critical that needs to be addressed quickly, today, not tomorrow. But this is also being driven by policy. This is being driven by economies and governments. So when you start to have policies in place that stipulate exactly how much you can pollute the environment, or how much of your mix can come from fossil fuels. This starts to become more and more important for the private industry to take it seriously, to start to shift their efforts into trying and becoming more sustainable and becoming greener. And so when I think about this industry as a whole, and I'm looking at the macroeconomics behind it, what's really fascinating is the energy industry has been shifting from just a sole provider, a sole source of energy, to a much more decentralized network. Now, what's meant by that is, the reason you'll see this image on the slide is the national grid, for example, over here. So not only in the United Kingdom, which is where I live, but even in the US, they're a player, and they're one of the main suppliers of electricity in the country. Okay, so the grid controls how you access electricity in the country. Now, their job is not as simple as we're getting energy from one place and then we have to distribute this across the entire country. They're now starting to receive millions of data points and a wide range of energy sources that come into the grid that need to get distributed effectively. Now, why this is so incredibly important is because demand and consumption for energy is not linear. We have different peaks of time when we require and where our demands for energy are higher. So for example, pre-COVID, you could say that when you come home, you'll switch on your TV, you'll be going for a shower, and you'll be utilizing your lights during the evening when sunlight's down. And so all of a sudden you'll have this peak and this spike of demand as a consumer that is then reflected on the data points that get sent back to the grid. So the grid can see that, in the evening, certain hours, these are peak times. Now, if you think about it from the energy mix, and you think about all the different sources of energy that are coming in, the other challenge you have is about the reliability or sustainability of where this is coming from, and how you have to create the perfect mix in order to give people their electricity, right? For people, when you think about your own needs, you talk about behind the meter, so the consumer on that front, all you care about is, do my lights go on? Is my fridge connected? Is my TV on? Can I watch Netflix? And that seems to be working, then that's fantastic and that's great. But from a national grid perspective, it's how do we manage all the different points of entry, and how do we understand and use big data and IoT to really be able to deliver all of the energy that's coming into our grid to our customers. And so talking about digital transformation and IoT, I think this is a great example of an institution that requires the ability and capability to be able to deal with all of this information and all of these different entry points into being able to provide a utility that we need as a nation, right? If I were to think a little bit about the complexity around how to do this, just a really quick example, not too long ago, only a few months ago, we had a blackout in part of the UK, which meant that all of a sudden, a number of households in the UK were not able to switch on their lights and internet, right? When you think about this back in the day, this was relatively common. If you go to some emerging markets, this is still common today. They use power generators to be able to deliver electricity when there is a blackout. And that's because the grid is not able to deliver this for whatever reason. Maybe supply at that given moment in time is low. And so today, when this happens, we take it for granted that we just come home and switch on a switch, and all of a sudden we have our electricity demands. But when you think about all the technology that is going into making this happen with this growing need, it's pretty fascinating. And so what I do as a business is we focus on one specific area, which is energy storage. So you have demand energy generation, which is the creating the supply of it, which was the graph that I showed before around the different sources, whether that's solar, wind, etc. And then the other part of that is, how do you store this energy? Now, the national grid has to do this as well. They do have to store a lot of the energy that comes into the grid in order to be able to deliver this to the consumer. The challenge we have today is the cost of storage is extremely high. And so what tends to happen is you're supplying energy pretty much in real time. And so when we think about fossil fuels, we have systems in place that exist today that make it relatively easy to store these and just supply it when it's needed, right? So you go to a gas station, you can fill up your car and off you go. And it's pretty straightforward. When it comes to renewable energy, the challenge we have is we need to be able to store this energy as soon as it's produced. So when you think about solar technology, if you have solar and it's sunny during a certain part of the day, there are obviously other components that go into the efficiency of solar technology and what's being built. But you need to be able to store that energy if you're not home, for example, and no one's using any electricity at that point in time. But because these batteries and these energy storage systems are really expensive, it becomes really, really challenging to address this problem. And so you have to think about a whole range of different solutions in order to make this work. Now, one of the things that is happening is you have organizations or institutions like the National Grid that have, of course, technologies and have battery, so they call them grid storage systems. And if you in your home have solar panels on your roof and you're producing energy which you're not using, what happens is you can actually send some of that energy back to the grid. And this has become quite common. And obviously, because you're generating or the energy that is being generated is on your property, then you get paid for this. And it's a way that you can sell it back to the grid for it to be utilized correctly. So in our company, in Global Nano Network, as I mentioned, what we're working on is developing an energy storage system that is recyclable, that is also more cost effective, that could potentially address this need. And we use this concept, which is, imagine if all of your energy requirements were met through truly sustainable sources of energy, right? So you have solar power, solar panels here, you have an energy storage battery, and then everything you do from there on, whether it's charge your electric vehicle, charge your mobile phones, watch TV, switch on your lights, have a shower, whatever that might be, it's all met through real sustainability. As I mentioned, this vision sounds more simple than it really is to execute due to the complexity of this industry. And so there are a number of different organizations trying to figure out, how do we do this? And it's not a one solution fits all. It's not going to be the case that there will be one type of battery that can do this and make it work. It's going to be a mix of systems and solutions that will be able to help this industry really thrive. And what we're starting to see is this shift in not only in demand, but awareness towards these greener, sustainable technologies, and especially with energy storage and battery technology. It is thought to be the case that Tesla has been really at the forefront of driving this revolution with their electric vehicles, and all of a sudden, as electric vehicles has been adopted more and more across the world, the need for these battery systems have grown tremendously, and that's really what's given a massive rise to this industry. Another quick note that I can share now is for those of you that do follow what is happening with electric vehicles, if you look just at Tesla's share price and you look at what is happening to some of the more, let's call them traditional manufacturers, Tesla's market cap has gone over and bypassed even Ford, right, in the US, and GM. In fact, their market value is higher than both of those organizations combined. In comparison, the number of vehicles that they're producing compared to the likes of Ford and GM is only a small fraction. So how is this possible? When you think about the number of employees that they have at Ford and General Motors, when you think about the systems and the amount of information and the history that they have, and also all the experience they have. How is it possible that an organization like Tesla, that's, you know, a decade old or so, is now all of a sudden surpassing their values and everything they're doing? It's truly because of this shift towards more sustainable sources of power. And so as part of that new initiative and this energy transition, with Tesla really leading the charge in large part, what you're starting to see is that policies are being put into place to be able to support this. So it started off with you would get some sort of subsidy to be able to put solar panels in your houses. So for people that were willing to do this, in many part, actually, when it first started, governments were pretty much funding these solar panels to be put in your home. So imagine that, right? You all of a sudden get a call to say, we're an organization, we want to come and fit in the solar panel, and you know, it's not going to cost you anything. These subsidies have stopped due to the heavy cost involved in it. If you look at electric vehicles, how this takes place is one of the things that we require is the infrastructure investment. So a big challenge for this entire ecosystem of electric vehicles is if there are not enough charging points, if there's not enough infrastructure investment coming from government, it's very difficult for manufacturers to be able to scale up more, and for, more importantly, consumers to buy into that proposition, and for consumers to adopt and buy electric vehicles because they're not able to charge their cars in many points. Now, obviously, you know, in countries like Spain, where BTS is, in UK, there are many, many more infrastructure points that there might be in more emerging markets where electric vehicles are still at their early stages. And so what's really critical is how economies and governments are starting to think about helping this shift, and what are the investments they're making, what are the policies that they're putting in place in order to be able to support these new companies, if you like, or new startups that are really trying to push the more sustainable sources of energy. And so as an example, one of the examples I wanted to share was in 2018, there were some studies that were conducted. And what the studies show was that over close to around 60% of the renewable energy that was generated from solar and wind in California was going to waste, right? They call it curtailment. And what that relates to is the inability to be able to store that energy. I think it was, closer to 40%. Now, if you want to put this into perspective, that's enough power to be able to meet the demands of close to 55,000 households. Okay, that's just to put things into perspective. So clearly, energy storage is part of this wider energy industry, is going to be extremely important in helping us understand or helping us meet this demand and really play a massive role when it comes to this the energy storage industry. So I'm just going to quickly check the Q&A part to see if anybody has any questions, but I'm more than happy to answer any questions at this point. So if you do feel like there is anything, just please shout out. So moving into the next section, what I wanted to be able to share with you was this move and this shift in energy transition is now starting to have a massive impact in the investment world. And so there are these two categories. One is impact investing, and they talk about ESG, which is environmental social governance. So what you're starting to see is that whilst brokers, traders, and organizations, they might have been buying into trading oil or trading fossil fuels due to the fact that, you know, it's a massive industry, energy consumption is increasing. As we've said, with more and more technology adoption, this industry is only going to grow more and more, and therefore the reliance on fossil fuels is greater, and so prices go up and down, and there's volatility, and traders will back that. Now what you're starting to see is that a lot of investment groups, venture capital funds, private equity organizations, they're starting to put their own goals in place in order to have ESG investments. So it's investments in organizations that are going to meet environmental and social goals. that are going to have a positive impact on society. And as this trend starts to grow more and more, policies start to be put in place in order for governments to be able to support this. You're starting to see more and more startups come into play that are really heavily dependent on this and that are trying to make their mark in this space. So just a quick image that helps explain this a little bit more. But what we're talking about is the more impactful the startup in helping us reach our sustainability goals, the more likely they're going to start to see them getting interest from private venture capitalists. And the reason I share this now and the reason I'm talking about this trend is with COVID, one of the things that's become very apparent is with this global lockdown, we're starting to see a radical shift take place with a number of different industries. If you think about how retail will now start to evolve into something very different than what we were probably used to. Over here in the UK, they're starting to talk about how if you go into a clothing store when they reopen, you're no longer going to be able to try your clothes. They need to maintain social distancing. People are going to have to start to wear masks in public places. And so with less and less people traveling, with technology playing a greater role within our lives, even thinking about environments like this, like education, where you're going to start to adopt technologies like Zoom, for example, to be able to deliver content and educate people. What we're starting to see is that there is this big shift towards an environment where actually we need to think a little bit more about our sustainability goals and how that's impacted based on what the current economic climate is. And so I bring this up because when people are thinking about innovation, when you as students or entrepreneurs or people as part of the wider ecosystem are thinking about innovation, where you can align yourselves or align your technology or your knowledge towards ESG type technologies, there is a greater chance that you're now going to be able to approach these type of investors. They are looking for opportunities to invest in that are meeting these or helping us meet these sustainability goals. And so this trend is starting to grow more and more. Only recently, I was having a conversation with a venture capitalist, and they were telling me that they were presented a few retail opportunities, so very clever, incredibly powerful retail technologies, but they weren't able to fund them at early stage because they just felt that with this radical shift that's taking place, there's a lot of uncertainty around what's going to happen with retail, and therefore it's not really going to be their focus right now. And what I believe is going to happen very shortly is we're going to see the same sort of trends taking place across a vast number of industries. And this is why it's so important. I think IoT, so the Internet of Things, digital transformation is only going to grow more and more. We're starting to see a massive amount of investment and focus being put on education for the younger generation, as well as those that are looking for higher education as well. And what we're seeing is clever ways to engage, clever ways to be able to deliver information and knowledge, and the amount of investment and grants that are going towards this is only growing over time. And I talk about this because this leads on to my final point, which is around how you're thinking about planning your next move. So I had a question, and just before I go on to this, let me just read out the question for those of you who can't see this, which is, do you know how any of the examples of manufacturers that are rarely purely operating on renewable energy, especially solar, and is this the biggest hurdle to this cost of energy storage? Is it really batteries? So the question being, sorry, let me rephrase that, which is, is there any organizations that is operating 100% on renewable energy? So that's a good question. The answer is I don't have any examples that I know of that operate purely on renewable. There are organizations, though, however, that are planning to shift towards it, even tech companies. For example, you have companies like Apple that have invested pretty heavily on solar, and what they've said is they want to be able to make their entire carbon emissions neutral. I can't remember the exact date, but they have given a date to say we want to make sure that we're carbon neutral by that specific date. Google is doing a very similar thing. There are also startups that have come into the energy mix that they themselves only supply sustainable sources of renewable energy. So I would imagine you could consider them to be, pretty much net neutral in that respect, because all they're doing is they're adding to the national grid and supplying energy to them. So the next question, which is, can we give some examples of how IoT can be applied to this? So that's a really great question. One of the things that this industry is really focused on is being able to utilize technology and big data in order to be able to help make those energy distribution decisions. And so you have things like that already exist today, like, for example, smart meters. Smart meters are already relaying information back to the grid to be able to share information like, what are those peaks in demand that you're having in your home, in the workplace, in industry, etc. How much energy is being consumed in real time. It's no longer about a monthly bill that comes, or even just a hypothesis of this is how much we predict you're going to spend for the next month, and therefore this is how much we're reserving towards it. There is now real-time information being fed into the grid that is helping make those decisions and helping them also plan the energy mix, right? Because as I mentioned with sustainable sources of energy, for example, windmills and solar, one of the things that's challenging is knowing how much energy you're going to obtain from these different sources. You obviously can look at historical data, and again, big data is playing a massive amount of a massive role in helping understand what those trends look like. But what you need to do is be able to manage and have mitigation strategies and have backup strategies in place so that you can switch on different types of energy at different points in time when demand peaks are higher or lower. That's where you have big data and IoT playing a massive role. So for example, within IoT, sensors that are able to trigger or be triggered to automatically switch certain types of energy on or off. Again, thinking about devices or different types of technology that can also play a role into making it easier for customers to understand what their own energy consumption is. So the way a smart meter can tell you how much energy you're consuming, at the same time, there's a massive shift towards educating people around how much you are consuming and how by just simply making smaller tweaks to your daily life, you can reduce your energy consumption. And it is also a big part of the education process where you're contributing to the greater good in some way or the other. And so IoT can play a role in helping out with even more, right? If you think of a connected fridge, how could a connected fridge help you potentially control your energy consumption within that fridge and potentially have different sensors in there to be able to control it, as another example as well. And so with energy storage specifically, and the question here regarding how does IoT or how could IoT potentially play a role with energy storage? You could look at it in a similar way. With battery technology, batteries themselves, they are very sophisticated pieces of equipment. It's not just essentially the polymer that goes into it. It's more to do with a lot of technology that goes around it. You have chips, you have sensors, you've got something which is called the BMS, which is the battery management system. So battery management systems need to be more and more clever in order to be able to make these things work. And I believe that IoT will be able to play a role in helping detect, at least collect data, be able to analyze the data, and even understand what are those trends, what's happening at that point to be able to fix it and make it better. There's an example of an organization that is right now trying to restore old batteries. One of the problems you have with batteries is sometimes battery packs are made up of multiple battery cells. And typically what you'll have is if you have many cells within one small battery pack, from a utility or what they call an end-of-life point of view, it could be that one cell has failed. And if one cell has failed, that battery is no longer working because they're all connected in series or parallel. What happens at that point in time is you have to figure out a way to repair this. So there's companies right now that are, what they're doing is they're looking at how they can regenerate those batteries or bring back to life those batteries. And they're using different types of technologies, also IoT, to be able to help them to understand exactly where the problem is and see how they can fix it. That's another example there. There's also the element of vehicle to grid. So the reason that demand has shifted so substantially is, as I mentioned, organizations like Tesla, when you start to think about the transportation industry as a whole, adopting sustainable sources or adopting batteries and becoming electric or through the process of electrification, that's when the demand starts to grow substantially. So this is why, people talk about how Tesla has played a massive role in helping with that transformation. It's because all of a sudden, when you talk about powering a car, it's very different to saying powering smaller devices like, wearable technology, etc. And so the demand now has grown substantially, right? Which is why he started to build gigafactories. And that's a big part of the shift. One of the things that are being invested in heavily right now, one of the technologies that's a massive focus is how can excess power that is currently residing within electric vehicles be sent back to the grid when it's not used? So you have your car at home. How can you actually shift that back into the grid when you're not needing it, and then at the same time get it when you do need it, right? So again, how do you utilize IoT in order to be able to push this technology, make it far more efficient, make sure that there's minimal energy loss in the process, etc., and be able to manage it, because there's a cost implication to all of this. So how do you think you can actually make that work as well? So there's another question here, which is, do you think it's harder to invest in any other in any field other than the medical one? I think it's because the focus is more on the medical field. Invest in any field. So you're absolutely right. I think if I put this question into perspective, one of the things that's become apparently clear is we're starting to see a massive shift in investment in healthcare as well. This has been ongoing for a number of years. Whether the country's run off of a public health service, which is provided through the taxpayers' money and it's free to all in the country, or whether it's through a more privatized industry, right? Investment in healthcare is massive. Thinking a little bit about, at the example I gave previously, wearable technology is a really good way to look at this. We're starting to get more and more people adopting wearable technology, whether it's thinking about the steps they're taking, et cetera, and how it's impacting their life, how many calories they've burned, et cetera, and what investments gone into this. But there are much more sophisticated investments as well, whether it's in the surgical environment in terms of how technology is playing a massive role there. The medical industry itself is definitely taking a role. In fact, what I'll do right now is I'll share with you one of my thoughts around how you can look at this. Let me just stop sharing here and share my browser. And what I wanted to do is just, as you'll see on the screen right now, is this is a UK government funding portal. And what you have over here is all the different competition calls. So applications that people can write in order to be able to be eligible for obtaining some form of grant or public funding money, right, to be able to develop ideas. And the reason I pull this up is you talk about healthcare and you talk about some of the challenges that are being, or some of the investments going into this. I like to use this portal as a barometer, and this is not, every country will have this as well. Another really good one to look at is Horizon 2020, which has been developed by the European Union and the UK as well as being a part of that. And what they've done is they start to look at what are the future needs of society, what are the technologies that are going to play a role in helping us get there, how do they meet the policy requirements that we put in place, or the sustainability goals that they have. And Horizon 2020 have what they call the Horizon 2020 sustainability goals around greener technology, sustainable, etc. And I look at this portal because sometimes what tends to happen is these ideas or these propositions are maybe a few years away. And so what tends to happen is startups are looking at how their ideas can gain traction or be utilized today, and what is the requirement right now. Many of them obviously do have the vision about what it's going to evolve into, 10, 20 years down the line. But this gives you a good indication as to where governments are thinking of investing money into. And when you talk about healthcare, as you can see over here, one of the things that are highlighted is the aging population. And what we're starting to see is how healthcare right now is really focusing on this. We know that due to COVID, a big proportion, a massive percentage of deaths have occurred in care homes, so elderly people, which means that we need to figure out ways and find solutions to take care of these people better. And technology and IoT are going to play a massive role into this as well. Here we go. Sorry. It's one of my first times using Zoom as well, so it's taking me a few clicks to get to the areas I wanted to get to. So this question, thanks for asking it. How could a device be added to the network eGrid through an express request to the company or using technology such as blockchain? So that's a really good question. I wouldn't feel I wouldn't say that I'm the best person to answer this, but I can give you my thoughts around how I feel this could work. If you think about blockchain technology, its uses and its capabilities, if there was a system put in place that allows you, think about APIs as an example, right? So if you have an API interface that was working well and was reliable and sustainable enough, you could potentially have some form of a system that enables you to utilize blockchain to be able to talk to the grid and operate in that fashion. I think what you would require, though, is heavy investment on the grid point of view in order to be able to make sure that the reliability and sustainability of that technology was working well. And the reason I say this is I can actually refer back and provide some conversation that I had where, speaking to someone from the national grid, one of the things that they mentioned to me was it's really great to see organizations investing in new technologies. From a national grid point of view, the thing that they look at is not only proof of concept, but it's market acceptance and its track record and behavior. The reason for that is if you think about the responsibility that the national grid has to be able to deliver that supply to the millions of people that require electricity or energy in a country, they cannot simply just turn around and say, oh, well, here's a startup that has some traction. They seem to do something very clever. Let's just add them into our energy mix, right? Because there are so many components that they need to think about and to be able to deliver. The responsibility you have is so great. And so I think, to answer your question here is, if you are thinking about devices and systems that are utilizing blockchain technology, while blockchain has been around for a while now and has been working extremely well, there's definitely case studies and proven technologies that show it works. I think what the grid would need to see is a mini micro ecosystem that shows how this has been working for a period of time and how these devices are contributing towards the system. And then from there on, that's how it gets plugged back into the grid. But that does not mean for a second that I don't think that there's a place or an opportunity where you can look at adding devices right now into this energy mix, right? It doesn't necessarily need to be at grid level. It can be behind the meter. So you could be thinking about utilizing and proving concept or developing technologies, as I mentioned, to help consumers right now with their energy consumption. right? And so it's plugged in at, let's call it a domestic environment. You're plugging into homes, and then from there, it starts to scale. As data starts to grow, in fact, it probably would be very interesting for the national grid, because at that point, as an organization, whether you're a startup or someone more established, the amount of data that you're going to be collecting could be extremely valuable to helping them understand, you know, different points, right? Whatever it is that you're measuring with this device specifically. So I think there's a number of different opportunities. It doesn't necessarily need to be something that's scaled directly to the national grid. But I think, yeah, I think there are a few ways that you could go about it and start to think about this specific thing. So thanks for all the answers, the questions. It's really interesting. If there's any follow-up, more than happy to address it. This leads really well into the next section, which was, I just wanted to take a few minutes before the end of the talk to just share my thoughts on the future and the next moves that you need to think about within your own careers as well, whether you're students or you're working already in organizations. I'm sure you're all seeing in the news that what's starting to happen is people are asking themselves this question around, am I working in an environment that is meeting my own objectives and it fits in line with my beliefs and what I believe is happening and where I would like to be in the future, right? And that's a number of combination of different things. You know, one, I think there's a lot more awareness around ESG. So as I mentioned, this environmental and social impact that these organizations are having. So employees are starting to ask themselves these questions around, am I happy? Do I feel the company I work for is doing enough in this area that it makes me feel good about my jobs? At the same time, the next thing I mentioned is, you know, we are yet to see what is going to happen post COVID-19 with so many different industries, so many different startups, with more and more people working remotely. I'm already starting to hear about a number of different companies that were in WeWork facilities that are no longer requiring office space. And the first thing they're doing is they're getting rid of all of their rent to reduce their overall costs. So what is going to happen in real estate? What's going to happen in retail? So it's really, really important for you to start to think a little bit about, where is the economy going? Where is the world going? What is the shift that's taking place? And how do you, as an innovator or someone with a lot of experience or skills within IoT or digital transformation, what is the role that you can actually play in this environment? And I say this because it's more and more important to be able to help, if you like, construct your CVs if you really understand what your own objectives are. And one of the things I wanted to do is go back to this website that I was sharing with you. Which is here. And as I mentioned, as you can see, the types of technologies that are being invested in are really, really vast. I mean, this is an example of hardware. So designing sustainable plastic solutions, right? Whilst they're thinking about how we utilize or repurpose plastic, which is a massive problem to the environment, there's not only a hardware component to this problem, there's also a software, or there's also a cloud-based solution to this problem around how we become more efficient at understanding potentially different types of materials. Maybe IoT plays a role within that, right? If we think a little bit about where we're going with manufacturing and automation, there are many, many different concepts there that where IoT and digital transformation play a massive role in helping those specific industries as well. And as I mentioned at the beginning with energy, the energy industry is not just batteries or fossil fuels or, you know, one element to it. You have so many different data points coming into it, so many different types of technologies that make up that mix, that even going into this transition, there's only going to be an incredible amount of opportunity being created there. And the same applies to that. So I really encourage you to think a little bit about it. And actually, I would consider, I mean, I would even suggest it's definitely worth even just logging on to some of these portals to look at what the government is funding. And I also say this because of two reasons. As I mentioned, without the infrastructure investment, technologies like and industries like electric vehicles cannot sustain themselves, right? They can tell you to go and install a charging point in your house. But if you're going to be driving up the entire country, when you get to the other end of there, what are you going to do? You need to charge your car. So you need public infrastructure investment. And that is a massive, that used to become or effectively it is today, a big barrier to entry for many technologies. If there isn't public adoption, how do you scale? So with hardware, that becomes really challenging. But even in those environments, you're starting to see these policies being put in place. And my comment here is, if you look at some of the investments that are being made right now by governments, it gives you a good indication as to what is to come. So if you're thinking about it from an innovation standpoint, or many times I get asked the question is, I want to start an idea. I want to create a startup. And this happens even within BTS, when students come and say, we have to deliver our final project, and we're thinking a little bit about the startup that we want to create. And it has to be a real startup. It has to be a real concept that has scale and it's viable, and we can deliver the proof of concept. A lot of the times the thinking goes around, how does it affect me directly? And that's a great place to start. It's great to think about it from, what am I really passionate about? Because passion will obviously drive excitement and ambition and help you with your ideas. And that's fantastic. What are the things that are broken in my life? Is this something that is a problem that many people are facing? And as a result, can I go and find a solution and deliver a solution for it? Great, that works really well. The thing about that, though, is sometimes you might have an idea which maybe is too early. You might have an idea that is part of a wider ecosystem. And so the challenge might be, you've got a great concept, but unless you partner with someone else, or there is this public infrastructure investment, it's very difficult to scale your business. And so going into portals like this, what it does is it gives you a really good opportunity to understand where investment is being made, where your idea is a small part of this larger public policy. You start to see how things come together. And potentially it's something that might take you a few years to develop, which is fine, because a lot of these investments are long-term. They're more about, how do we invest in R&D at an early stage to help with this transition that we're trying to make in society towards better education, towards providing access to energy in rural areas. And what you'll see here is not only investments in a specific country, like this is, of course, the portal for the UK. As I mentioned, every country has this, right? Every country will have a portal where you can apply for grants and look at what is being invested in infrastructure from a policy standpoint as well. But many times what you'll see is that they're collaborations. So over here, as an example, you've got the Eureka Collaborative R&D, UK, Sweden, Aerospace 2020, right? What is the aerospace industry going to look like in the future? And what they're doing here is they've got a very specific criteria about what they believe it could be, or what is important at this point in time for them to research to develop technologies. And as I mentioned, it is not all hardware driven. In fact, there's a massive focus on digital cloud-based technologies. And so again, this gives you a really good place for you to start to think a little bit about it. And if you have the expertise and you've got the knowledge in a certain area that can contribute to this, it's a great place to start to think about where the future is going. So I'm just going to quickly check if there are any other questions, but just leaving you with my final thoughts on that. When you think about your careers, the next moves you're making, it's really important to look at where the economy is going and what are the trends that are taking place, both from an investment standpoint, because as I mentioned, if you are developing a technology that's really, really great, but was for pre-COVID time, then potentially investors today are thinking it may not work in today's environment, or more importantly, it doesn't meet the ESG standards and goals that we've set ourselves. So how do you start to incorporate that within your solution today? That's becoming a much, much bigger part of the portfolio of these large funds. And it's becoming a much more part of the wider ecosystem where, big organizations are starting to think about the types of startups that they want to acquire and how that helps them promote these ESG goals that they have, and how it's good for their brand to promote the sustainability element as well. So yeah, that's the end of the talk. I'm not sure if there are any more questions that you have. I'll give it a minute, and in that process, if there aren't, then yeah, I just wanted to thank you all for taking the time to listen to this talk. And yeah, my email is at the front of the slide. I believe this presentation gets shared online as well. So if there are any questions in the future, I'm more than happy to address them as well. Yeah, and as a final point, the only thing I wanted to request is there is a really quick short survey. If you wouldn't mind filling it, I think it takes no longer than 1 minute. It just it helps with getting feedback whether this talk was useful, and the topic was useful as well. So if you wouldn't mind just filling that out, that would be fantastic. And yeah, thank you again. Thanks for your time.